all for coming today. I'm Crystal Diff, the Executive Director for Boca Grande Historical Society, and I really appreciate you all coming out today. We are starting and trying to keep up our in-person programs as much as possible. We also are going to be recording this lecture so that you can view it later on, or for your friends who weren't able to show up today, we will be able to have that on our website. So please let everybody know this lecture will be available for everybody after today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Martha Bireda. She has worked as the director of the Blanchard House Museum of African American History and Culture for over 30 years. It's located in Punta Gorda. She's a Florida humanities speaker and the Speakers Bureau. So we're very, very pleased to have her out at Boca Grande. I also just really appreciate what she did to help really tie some of our shared history between Punta Gorda and Gasparilla Island. There are some familiar names, so as she's talking in her presentation today, keep track of some of those names, pay attention to some of those names, because a lot of the same developers and movers and shakers that were here on our island were also out in Punta Gorda. And so please pay attention to that, and we're very proud to have her out today. We have a couple of sponsors that I would also like to thank. We have, of course, the Florida Humanities and Culture Builds Florida. They were a sponsor today for Martha herself to come out and speak. We also have the, Ransom Wilcox Foundation that helped sponsor today. We have Bob and Pam Heilman and also the Shively Charitable Foundation. So we had a lot of support to bring this history out to you today and talk to you about some of the issues with segregation and what history was like during times of segregation and Jim Crow laws in Florida and in the Southwest Florida area. Please, when you are done watching this lecture today, please fill out a survey for us. We'll be providing those surveys afterwards. We are going to turn those in to the Florida Humanities Council, so please tell them how great of a job that Martha did today so that they can hear all the good news. We'll have those available. I'll be passing them around. We also will have some up front. They also have provided us with forum magazines, so please feel free to take one or a few of those for your friends. Those were provided for free by the Florida Humanities Council. So thank you all, and without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Martha Bireda.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm so happy to see you out this afternoon. I absolutely love coming to Boca Grande. I have very, very pleasant memories of coming to Boca Grande during my childhood. In fact, during the years of Jim Crow, Boca Grande was the colored beach. We could come down, and you know the way the streets, you can turn off the street and drive down to the beach. That's what we used to do. Reverend Nightingale, whose wife, Mary, drove the school bus into Punta Gorda, would load us up on his truck, and we would have hay rides, and we would ride down to Boca Grande. Now, there are many people in Punta Gorda who also are connected here. My good friend, I call her my godmother, Gussie Baker, and her family have connections here. Some of you may remember Smiley. We called her Smiley. Yes, you're shaking your head. You remember Smiley was not forgettable, was she? You can remember Smiley. Yes, Henry Woodson. She was a friend, lived in the neighborhood. And then I discovered some other people as I looked at the information. One of my very close friends, John Allen's family, the Reverend Frank Allen, and his wife even had lived down here. So there are many people who have connections with Punta Gorda. Now, there's one man I cannot yet find a connection for, and that's the man you all call Mr. Murdoch. Nobody seems to know who he is, but I'm still working on him. We have those connections, but there's also a very, very special connection between Punta Gorda and Boca Grande. And as I get into the presentation, I will talk about that very special connection and why it is so special and how I believe it influenced the social climates of both Punta Gorda and Boca Grande. Now, Punta Gorda, this is not Martha Bireda's term. Years ago, Punta Gorda was called a unique sociology. And so you say, oh my goodness, what do they mean? What's so unique? What's the unique sociology about Punta Gorda? And by the way, Crystal, I have to correct this. I've only been in the Blanchard house since 2004. 30 years I did other work, okay? All right. All right. So let's see, what is this? Anybody have any thoughts about what could be a unique sociology about Punta Gorda? Anybody? Unique sociology. Well, let's check it out. We're going to talk about the little town that Unity built, and it was that's what that unique sociology is about the unity that little town, the way it was built. The unique sociology has to do with the development and the settlement of Punta Gorda. How did this little southern town, and we're talking about the Jim Crow era, we're talking about that whole era that came in after Reconstruction, how did this little town in Florida become different than its neighboring towns? How did the mutual respect and personal relationships, and many personal relationships among the old timers, and very important, I'm talking about Jim Crow, how did opportunities for both whites and blacks happen to occur in this little southern town? It does have a unique sociology. All right, let's consider this climate at the time, okay, when Punta Gorda was established. It was unlike all the little surrounding towns. Something made it different. What was it that made it different? Florida was not always the sunshine state, especially for colored people. It passed some of the most stringent and harsh Jim Crow laws in the South. This was our state of Florida. Also, Jim Crow, as I think we know, was the conditions that were established after Reconstruction so that the white supremacy could be at the top. Whites could again be at the apex of the racial paradigm, of the racial hierarchy in the South. It also was established so that this whole domination, the domination could continue, and that there would be unequal opportunities for blacks and other non-whites. So this whole Jim Crow had its beginning after the freedoms that were established during the Reconstruction. One of the ways that was used to keep, and the term that we're thinking about is place. When you think about Jim Crow, you think about place. White place was at the top of the racial hierarchy. Black place was at the bottom. And if blacks got out of their place, they were punished, usually with violence. Here's some of the things that happened, some of the terrorism in Florida. In Liberia, right 100 miles from us, African Americans left the United States to go settle in Liberia. 1881, the New York Daily was reporting all this kind of mob violence in Florida. And as I mentioned before, these extreme Jim Crow laws were passed. Something as almost as silly as if I saw a white and a black of opposite sex just probably talking, and if I thought they had a relationship, I could turn them in and get me $1,000. That's how stringent the laws were. In 1886, right up in Pasco County, there was a massacre. And then in 1887, which is very interesting as you continue to listen to the lecture, 1887, Arcadia declared itself as an all-white Christian community. So we talk about this. What factors influenced this? The unique sociology was a biracial unity that contributed to, very important in the South, a shared prosperity. Very important in the early years. I've come up with 6 possible factors that may have made Punta Gorda a little different than the surrounding towns. If you take a look at what was happening in Fort Myers, in Bartow, where they had a wall that separated the races. In Fort Myers, there was racial violence, lynchings. What were those possible factors? And here are the factors that I've come up with. First of all, the earliest settlement was by Unionists. Secondly, I think most of us know what what undeveloped Florida is like. Have you ever been on the old 41 going down to Miami? You know what old Florida looks like? You know what it can feel like? Okay. They had, if they're going to create a town, they had to work together to create this town. Thirdly, was on the part of the man that I'm going to talk about, he had the progressive versus the redemptive thinking. Redemptive thinking at this point in time was redeeming white supremacy. And so, as opposed to the progressive, that we will work together and build a union. The economy was basically not agrarian. There was, planting and gardening, and I'll talk about a little of that, but basically it was not agrarian. That made a lot of difference in terms of the ex-slaves, the children of ex-slaves, and the fact that they could actually see the products of their labor. It wasn't sharecropping. Then there was this consciousness of a shared prosperity. This is key here. Despite Jim Crow laws, when I talk about that, think it was never meant. The whole thing with the white supremacy and Jim Crow was inequality. It did not speak of shared anything. In Punta Gorda, there was shared prosperity. And then I have come to learn, and I think all of us know the very power of the press. The press, and I think we see it right now in what's happening in our country, the press is very powerful in shaping our beliefs and our attitudes and our actions. But in Punta Gorda, generally, there was very positive reporting about the colored citizens, and they called them colored citizens in Punta Gorda. Here is the man. This is our special connection. This man, Albert Gilchrist, who became the governor of Florida. Coming over here, I passed his avenue. All of you know his avenue? Yes, I passed Gilchrist Avenue. Yes, this is the man. I think really, and as I tell you about him, you'll see why I consider him to be a very special man. He was our 20th governor, and basically he was probably the most famous. You've had some other famous, you've had the presidents come down and all of that on Boca Grande. But during this era, he was probably the most famous of our residents, Punta Gorda and Boca Grande. He came as a civil engineer, that was his training, and a surveyor for the Florida Southern Railway. As he was here, he became a land investor and a developer, which of course brought him over to this area. And he was very active in politics. Now, and I'll talk about what he did in 1885, but in 1897, he platted and named the town of Boca Grande. All of you know that. You know that about him. That's why you've got that street name. There's a 6-block area, and you probably know the area. It runs from 1st to 3rd, and from Gilchrist to Palm Avenue. That is the area that he planted. That's Gilchrist. So when you're walking down that and you're riding down that, think of this man and how special he was. And Gilchrist Avenue is one of the main streets on the island. He was a very special man. He was elected to the state legislature in 1893, And he ran for Speaker of the House, and then finally he got, in 1905, he was victory, and then he ran as a Democrat. He was a man who could work with both parties, but if you were running for an office in Florida at that time, you would have had to run for a Democratic office, no matter maybe what his personal, and it seemed like his thoughts and his opinions were not so much with the Democratic thinking, but because he was in politics, he ran as a Democrat. As in many times right here in the state of Florida, no matter what your thinking is, because the Republican Party is very strong, people run as Republicans. So that's what he did. He ran as a Democrat so that he could achieve the goals that he wanted to achieve. Now, let's go start a little earlier. This is one of the Unionists, Nathan Decoster. You'll see that he was a lieutenant. He was, and actually he in 1865, he was down with the colored troops in Fort Myers. They had the blockade there. And then about a year later, 1866, he and 4 of his ex-colored soldiers that worked under him, John Lomans, Joseph Chapman, Richard Hamblin, and Mitchell Harrison, they came together. He bought a sawmill, and they came together and worked together to establish Hickory Bluff. I think we all know that one man couldn't have done it by himself. So those 5 men worked together to establish Hickory Bluff. He built the sawmill, and a dozen families ended up moving there. They had a store, a post office. It shouldn't be a school and a school. It should be a school and a church. Okay. So a second, we've got these men here. They're on Hickory Bluff. But as I said before, Florida frontier is nothing to play with. Cypress, palmettos, rattlesnakes, bears, alligators, and the worst of all were the mosquitoes. It was some rough territory. So to get a town built, to get some things done, folks had to work together to get things done. Now, some 20 years later, after Decoster came, and I remember, if you know Punta Gorda, he's on the other side of Peace River, of the harbor. That's where that little village was. About the same time, in 1885, Gilchrist came then to Punta Gorda. And so he was hired to come and lay out the railroad, to survey the railroad for the terminus, to come from Bartow. And he brought with him an all-black survey team. This survey team was led by Dan Smith, and Dan Smith's daughter. This was the only 4 people. There were 7 of them, but the only ones that she could think of, Cousin Carrie, these were the people that she could think of. Sam Kennedy came, Graham, Fuller, and Ransom. And they came to lay out the right-of-way for Bartow. And of course, the railroad was completed in 1886. Now, this is where we start to talk about this special man. I really believe that his positive attitudes about race influenced both the social environment of Punta Gorda and Boca Grande. I've read the interviews that were done with the colored citizens here. And of course, there was Jim Crow. But in their interviews, I did not find a sense of fear that there was violence here. People seemed to get along here. And I think that had a lot to do with his attitude. Very important, in the midst of Jim Crow, and we're talking about black codes. We're talking about keeping black men especially in a subservient position. He ignored the stereotypes. You know, a stereotype of a lazy, ignorant, sorry, irresponsible, childlike black man. He ignored it. He trained them to be surveyors, not to just be laborers, but to be surveyors. He saw something. He could think beyond the stereotypes. And he encouraged the abilities of, I have to say very proudly, my great uncle, Dan Smith, who was only 17 at the time that he came here. He was also progressive in his thinking about the education of colored children. Remember, in slavery, you'd be killed for learning to read, and Jim Crow was not about to want a whole bunch of educated people. That's why he had to finally do away with the Freedmen's Bureau. Schools, African, colored schools at the time were set on fire. And so, but here was a man who believed in the education of colored children. He sent Dan Smith to the conference to find a colored teacher, and he came back with our beloved Benjamin Baker, who was one of the first teachers to retire under the Florida teachers' retirement system. And finally, in his respect for all people, I remember this as a child. In his will, he granted every Halloween the children of Punta Gorda would get ice cream. Now, during Jim Crow, in which I grew up, we got our ice cream at a separate place. We could not be there together with the white kids, but he made sure that the colored children got ice cream as well. He was a man of a different thinking. And one of the things I have to mention about him, when Dan Smith came, 17-year-old Dan Smith, he was the child of enslaved, he couldn't read or write. And he did marry Louisa, who was his wife. She could read and write. She did some teaching of him. But in Punta Gorda, among the pioneers, the colored pioneers, the desire for education was so strong that Dan Smith and other colored men sat in classes with children so that they would have enough people, the quota, so that they could have a school. Now, what Gilchrist saw in Dan Smith was probably his great mathematical abilities. That's what he was very good at. He became a very successful businessman, very successful fisherman. Very interesting. I think in his DNA, he had mathematics. Two of his daughters became very prominent math teachers in the whole state of Florida. 3 of Dan Smith's grandsons worked for NASA. So that DNA was there, and Gilchrist saw it and respected it. And this is Uncle Dan, as he was called, Dan Smith. The very first service that was held in Punta Gorda, religious service, was held in a thatched hut like this, which later became the Bethel AME Church. Remember unique sociology? It was integrated service. The folks who lived there, all of them came to that very first service. It's not a segregated service. We were in a little town in the south, and it was an integrated service. Now, from what the old timers tell me, they continued to meet together with Dan Smith until each got their own money and they built their own churches. But the first service in Punta Gorda, in this little town in the south, was an integrated church service. And it's very interesting because in the 60s, it was probably in the 50s, Dr. King said the most segregated hour in America was 11 o'clock on Sundays. And yet, in 1886, whites and blacks went together and attended a church service. And there it is, his first service, organized there. And take a look at the attendees. Some of you will know some of the names. Mr. Reese is African American, Mr. Andrews, the Jacksons, but the Trebeus, the Wartiskis, the Goldsteins, the Sandlins, they were all white. This was the service that they attended. Okay? And this was one of the articles that was in the paper about Dan Smith. Said when he came here, there were only 15 people, 8 were white, 7 were black. He and Kennedy, another popular notice in the newspaper, he is called Citizen. colored people were not referred to as citizens, maybe darkies or other words, but not citizens. They were the only ones of the original 15 who were left. Look at what he did. Dan was the first one to move for the organization of a church, yes, and the grant of a public school for Punta Gorda, and in his efforts, they were successful. Think about it. Think about the potential that sometimes we don't see in people. A 17-year-old who could not read and write. Look at who he became. Now, this gets to be interesting because, remember I mentioned 1887, what was happening in Arcadia? And in 1889, a couple of years after this, our Senate wanted to just remove that whole thing about African Americans or colored people being able to vote. But in 1887, now remember 1885, Florida passed these laws, some of the worst and the most stringent Jim Crow laws in the South. So here you are, 2 years later, in this little town, they actually are going to let colored men vote to incorporate the town? What kind of people are these? They are going to actually let 4 colored men vote to incorporate Punta Gorda. They all had to be landowners. They all were. In fact, Sam Kennedy was the first African American to own property locally. Dan Smith was very involved in this process, but he hadn't registered to vote. He didn't own property yet. But African Americans were involved in this. But this is really significant in this time period that this could happen. So do you see why sometimes it has been called this unique sociology? Some things were happening here that did not happen anywhere else in the South. And we come to Robert Meacham. Anybody ever heard that name? Some of you have? Okay. Robert Meacham was one of the legislators in the Reconstruction government. Remember, the South had to establish another government. They had to abide by the rules. They had to agree to the 14th Amendment, those kinds of things. He was, for Punta Gorda, he was appointed our postmaster in 1892. Now, there was some little gossip around that Tribune was angry about the town being taken out of his name and put in Punta Gorda, and said, I'll fix you. I'll bring in a colored postmaster. And so Meacham had a little trouble, a little time, because the Fort Myers Press just wore it out. Fort Myers Press could not let people forget that Robert Meacham was colored. He was a leader during the Reconstruction. He was state senator. He did help write. Here's a man who has all the qualifications. Why not? He could help write the Florida Constitution. And one of the things, and I'll come back to that, he did establish the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the state of Florida. But the one before that is very important. Most people do not realize, because there was a lot of talk about how negative Reconstruction was. The very most positive thing that happened in Reconstruction was free public schools for all children. The reason that we have those free public schools for all children was Robert Meacham. That's what he advocated for. A lot of people don't realize that if you weren't a planter, education was not promoted. They sent their own children to school. They did not provide taxes for public education. And so Robert Meacham is responsible for free public education for all children in Florida. Now, African Americans were involved in all aspects of the civic life in Punta Gorda. They had many organizations. Self-help was one of the values that they had. They had the self-help burial lodges. They saved their money. They had the American Woodmen. They had the Masons. They had the Eastern Stars. They had all kinds of self-help organizations. And they met at the Masonic Hall and the wharf that was built in Punta Gorda. Dan Smith gave money and helped to build it. They gave money and they helped to build the city dock down at, which is Fisherman's Village now, that original dock. They helped to do that. They helped to build the Charlotte Harbor Bridge. All of these things they were volunteered to do. They were a part of the civic life, and they were allowed to do it. They were allowed to work to help build the city, the building of the Tamiami Trail. And the Colored People Civic Association gave funds for the new artesian well. Now, there were two incidences where I have to wonder about them. One, in the Punta Gorda Herald, at one point, the colored men had raised the most money for the golf course. However, I don't think that I think there was too much friendship in Punta Gorda. They didn't realize Jim Crow laws, so they could not golf on that golf course. But it did show how they had raised money for the golf course. And again, for the public hospital that we got there, African Americans bought bonds. My grandmother, Martha Andrews, bought a $50 bond. However, when she got some poisoning, we had to take her to Tampa, to the hospital. So, but because guess what the Jim Crow law says? What did it say? Couldn't be in the same hospital. Or if you had one, you had to have separate facilities. And so, while relationships and customs may have been different in Punta Gorda, there was Jim Crow. So everything was not perfect. Don't let me give you the impression that I thought everything was perfect growing up. There was Jim Crow. Now, the economy was very, very interesting. Basically, it was based upon commercial and sports fishing. Now, we did have a pineapple economy there until about 1917 when the freeze came. A lot of people worked in that. But we really were not agrarian in the sense that other places were. We were called the Golden Gate of the Gulf because guess what? And you all were involved in this too. We were the largest shipper of fresh fish in the United States. Right where across the street from the hospital in Punta Gorda on Marion Avenue, there is a condo. And right there was what was called Sharpie Town. The colored fishermen made their little boats there called Sharpies. And if you go to South Carolina, you look at some of the boats that the Gullah people made, very much the same way. And so they had their own little dock. And as far as I have heard, I do not know, I talked to the old timers. There were 7 wholesale places there. As far as I know, the colored fishermen were paid equal prices for their fish, as far as I know. We had captains of crews, Ben Coleman and Tall Boy, as he was called. They had their own boats. So you had the independent African American fishermen. And many times when I talk about this, I ask, do you know what, I'm talking about real fishermen or shrimper, because for a long time in my life, my companion was from one of those shrimping and fishing families, and I know what their personalities were like. And so, can you really see a man who becomes a fisherman being a sharecropper? They only believe in God and the ocean. That's the only thing they bow to. So these men were able to do what their parents could not do. They could see the benefit of their labors. And apparently the group that came, they were entrepreneurs. Now, the Charlotte Hotel, let me go back to that now. Yeah, I didn't miss anything. Okay. Once you get the land, you had to build a railroad, but you also had to build a luxury hotel, like the Plant Hotel, which now in Tampa, I worked there when it was University of Tampa, and our classrooms were there, but now it's been turned into a total museum, but it is worth seeing, because if you go to the Plant Museum, you will know what this hotel was about. If you go to the Flagler, you will know what this was about, okay? In the hallways, people would push you along from room to room. So all of these hotels were very elegant hotels, and they were hotels that only the very rich came to. Now, Cantor Brown says in terms of, he's historian, in terms of African Americans in this town, that there were at least, when the second train came in, at least 200 African Americans came in to build that railroad. He also said on that train, about 500 African Americans came in to build the hotel. According to him, at one time, Punta Gorda was an African American town. And my mother, Bernice Russell, said that you really can't tell the history of Punta Gorda without telling African American history. And as I look at your history in Boca Grande, I'm sure the same thing is true. When you think about the industry that was here in Boca Grande, you cannot, and I understand the pay was pretty good, that you cannot tell the pay for these fishermen. The pay was good. I took a look at one of the census and looked at what the women did. The wives of fishermen in Punta Gorda were housewives. The other colored women may have to go out and do domestic work or whatever, but it was good money. Even when I was growing up, fishermen were said to make good money. And women, including one of my great aunts, Aunt Annie, somehow there was a grapevine that let people know when a fisherman's wife had died and he was free. My great aunts, the word went to Mariana. She came down and married Mr. Roberts. And that's what happened many times. In fact, our own Mrs. Blanchard was the fourth wife of a fisherman, Mr. Blanchard. So there was something, and I'm sure what happened around here is that women came to Boca Grande when they heard about how much money these men were making on the docks around here. So the people who came here were wealthy people. It was also the home of Silver King Tarpon. The major tarpon guides were African Americans. Here were some of them. And sometimes you can see some of the very iconic pictures that show them. So the wealthy visitors would come, they'd come in their yachts. They didn't just come in boats. They came in yachts, and they would let them stay with George Brown, and then they would, of course, stay for a short period of time. The local people in town did not go to the hotel. That hotel was not for them. It was for the very wealthy who came down. I am told from the old timers, though, sometimes in the summertime, they would let the local white children swim in the pool if they were sure that they cleaned it out when they left. This was very important, the shared prosperity, that the African American businesses were located in the Central Business District along 41, just King Street, and Marion Avenue. We had a colored hotel. O.B. Armstrong, who had been in the colored troops, was very popular in Punta Gorda. He owned a grocery and a restaurant. He, of course, could read and write. He was a very important Republican. And Starlight Barbershop, one of our ancestors just died in June. Abe Coleman's grandfather owned that. It was downtown, but guess what? He could only serve whites. He could not have both going into that shop. And then Dolly Hurst, she was an old timer. She had her market. Now this is what I think was comical, but true. I mean, this says something about Punta Gorda. I'm just going to give you to read this. Just take a look at this. Employment agency has been opened by a what? A live colored man. And where is it going to be? On Marion Avenue? This was in the paper, okay? That's what it said. So he felt free, and apparently he was welcome to open his employment agency, a live colored man, on Marion Avenue. I thought that was really cute. And then we have George Brown. George Brown was a major landowner. a major employer, and probably one of the richest men in Punta Gorda. That didn't happen a lot because of envy, and we know what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We know what happened in Rosewood. And I'll tell you about a little incident, but shared prosperity endured. He was the owner of the Cleveland Marine Steamways, which was at the time the largest steamway in the Southwest Florida. He has said, when I talked to the old timers, that he owned half of Punta Gorda. He was again said to be one of the richest men in Punta Gorda. And I talked to an old timer whose mother worked in the clerk's office, the tax office. She told me, when the town ran out of money, they would go to George Brown, ask him to pay his taxes early, and he would do it. He was a major employer of blacks and whites, and probably was one of the nation's first equal opportunity employers. Again, I talked to, because I needed to know how people got along, especially during this period, and especially in Punta Gorda. I was very curious about it. The old timers said there was no friction. They went in, they did their work, each did his own work that he was supposed to do. They worked together, and George Brown paid them equal pay. Now, I had to ask some other people about this. Ask some colored folks I knew and some white folks I knew about Mr. Brown in Maxwell's Drugstore. You know, eating was one of the real taboos of Jim Crow. You were never supposed to eat and drink in the same room. Never. That was the top taboo. Well, I was told that Mr. Brown, that was who he was called, could go to Maxwell's Drugstore and could sit down, read his paper, and eat his ice cream. That's how much respect the man got. He's also a philanthropist. He did a lot in Punta Gorda. Our old courthouse was built on land that he did sell the city. So he owned a lot of property around that area. And if you come to Punta Gorda on Olympia Avenue, you will see a mural. It's just been redone, of George Brown. There he is with one of his neighbor's kids, a man very well liked. I had just come home and was not involved in anything, and some old ladies from Cleveland called me, and they said, did I know what was going on, that his property was going to be sold. The county commission allowed his property to be sold, and the street that his property was on to be closed off. These women knew him as a neighbor, and they were very upset. The day that they made the decision, the old ladies were not told about it, and so they could not go and protest. They knew that his home was it is a historic home, but you do not have access to it. But his neighbors cared enough. I had just come home. My mother was deceased. I had just come home, and they were concerned that not enough respect was given to George Brown. So because racism did not prevent him from using his gifts, everybody in Punta Gorda benefited. I am told again by old timers that the people who worked for him during the Depression did not suffer like other people. Unity does mean shared prosperity. We can work together. In fact, there's a new book, I forget the name of it, that talks about the price that everybody pays when we don't believe in shared prosperity. Because of racial unity, the whole of Punta Gorda prospered, especially during the Depression, because of unity. The last item, the press, very important in shaping beliefs and views. And basically, it took a very positive approach to, if you look through it, colored news was there. It was just mixed in, colored news. Benjamin Baker, when he wanted to have a concert at school, he just put it in the paper. The audiences were mixed that would come to the school. Colored citizen was the term that was used. If someone died, they talk about an outstanding colored citizen who would be missed. Now, there was one reporter, I have to say, and as I looked at his pattern, he was the only one who ever used the word darky. But guess who he used the darky when he was referring to? Punta Gorda, I told you about the fishermen, you had businessmen, you had a small elite. An elite that actually on Sunday afternoons, the colored women would dress up and they'd come down to Boca Grande. That's what they did. They took excursions to Boca Grande. Well, this reporter, every time he talked about this group of people, he called them darkies. Well, the darkies took a trip on Sunday down to Boca Grande. He was the only one. So there was obviously some envy about the prosperity of these people. So changes did come. We know the Jim Crow laws and customs did prevail. The 1920s, when they had the boom and everybody was buying land, new citizens came in with new attitudes. 1922, we did have a KKK. And in 1933, and I'm still trying to find out, I can't find it from our papers, what was going on that Willie Haynes, Annie Haynes, and my grandmother established the NAACP. But we do know that the 20s and 30s, with the reoccurrence of the Klan, had become very difficult. We do know that in the 1920s, we had the most violent election in the country's history in Ocoee. And by the way, if you'd like to see that exhibit of the Ocoee massacre, it is at the Blanchard House. It's Untold and Untaught History. And we are open 10 to 2, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you have a group that wants to come, you just need to let us know. But things did change. Now, one of the things that happens is a lot of people, many people, and I'm not generalizing or stereotyping northern people, but I know in places that the many colored migrated, they had the covenants about housing. And so in many places in the north, blacks and whites live totally separate lives, where in many places in the south, right here on Marion Avenue, blacks and whites lived on the same street. On my street, blacks and whites lived on the same street. And so different attitudes be depending upon how much relationship one had with the other race made a difference. And that was one of the things that was said about Gilchrist, is that he was from Georgia, but he had worked with colored people and he knew colored people. The descendants of the first families still remain close. As I said, I call Gussie Baker my godmother. Her mother and my mother were the closest of friends. Their mothers were the closest of friends. Despite these Jim Crow laws that were meant to keep people apart, to segregate, to discriminate, relationships and friendships were formed. This biracial community has been very positive for Punta Gorda. The racial unity was there, and there was not, the class differences were not so strict. An old man not too long ago told me, and he was talking mostly about class, talking about class and race, and he said he had seen the most separation in Punta Gorda now than he'd ever seen during Jim Crow. And that should not be, because these people, that was not who they were about. And so one of the things that happened, Charlotte High School, we were one of the first schools in the state to voluntarily integrate. Voluntarily. You know how it happened? It happened because of the old timers, because of the relationships between the old timers. We were integrated. There's no press out there. There's no police. There were no parents shouting, go back to your own school. Two daughters of two of the old families, Gussie Baker and Bessie Haynes Bryant, got together. They did their little meetings. They decided, they talked to some other people in the community, what colored students, you had to be smart and you had to be ones who wouldn't fight back. They worked it out secretly, but they were old families. They knew each other. They could do that. And the Bailey Terminal, if you come into Punta Gorda, you will see the Bailey Terminal. There's a mural there, and also there's a little Bailey Park out near the Blanchard house across the street. And they were very well-known family in Punta Gorda. And if you look during the Second World War especially, the paper just carried stories and stories and stories about the Bailey boys, and the terminal was named in their honor. I am a 5th or 6th generation Floridian, and I'm very proud to say that I am the great niece of Dan Smith. My mother, that's why she wanted the Blanchard House Museum. She was just very proud of her family and the beginnings of the contributions of African Americans. She's very proud of her town, the fact that her town was so different from neighboring towns. I'm proud of my beginnings in Punta Gorda, and that unity brought mutual respect, the recognition of our connectedness. We were connected, had to be connected. We shared prosperity. We built relationships, and we worked towards a common good. Now, I do know, because I did work in race relations and equity for about 30 years, I've been to towns where black businesses were burned. Now, Mr. Brown, there was one little incident. Mr. Brown was a very wealthy man, and he, of course, wanted to build a house on the river that was, he would be accustomed to. There was a little talk in town that that house was too good for a colored man. So he was wise enough to just build another house, a very nice house, modest house. I've been to that house. But the one thing that I did notice is that nobody ever threatened to burn down the Cleveland Steamways. That was shared prosperity. No one was foolish enough to do that. And yet I know in the towns, I visited towns where black businesses were burned. So here was a man who was able to hire blacks and whites. Jim Crow, whites did not work for blacks. Blacks only worked for whites. He was able to do that. And so the pioneers of both Hickory Bluff and Punta Gorda, I think, provide us as a community, Boca Grande, Punta Gorda, as a model. And actually, they can provide our nation as a model that we do not have to live separately. We are connected. And if we believe in goodwill and respect for everybody and shared prosperity, we really can reach all the goals we want to reach as a nation. I thank you for attending. I thank you for just remember, unity. I know right now things are so divided. Unity is possible if we sit and talk to each other. Imagine what your political party is, what one view is about wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. Sit and talk to each other. Have respect for each other. Unity is possible. And my little town, and I'm going to say your little town too, is a perfect example of a model for our nation. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you from all of us. Thank you for coming out. Does anybody have any questions for Martha today? I can go around with the microphone. If you do, you can raise your hand. Does anybody have questions?
I have a question, but I can yell.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, with everything that was happening in the towns around Punta Gorda, nobody ever came in and tried to make trouble? Nobody from outside ever tried to come in and create difficulties?
As far as I know not, but let me say something about, apparently our police force was not hostile to blacks. And so we have an area that used to be called Down the Street. It had 2 bars, a little shopping mall. There was a band that played. African Americans from, as far as Tampa, Sarasota, Venice, Arcadia, Bartow, Fort Myers, they would come to Punta Gorda on the weekends because the attitude and the climate was better. So whatever, if there was anybody trying to stir up trouble, it didn't, our city didn't let it happen, okay? In fact, we did have a Klan, and I just recently talked to some old timers, and they said people were really like embarrassed. They don't want you to know that they were part of it, because I asked, I said, what did they do? Now, I know one thing they did. They burned down something called the Big House, where there was a lot of miscegenation going on. And so the Klan didn't like that so much. They did burn that down. But I asked, what did they do? Never saw a cross burned, never saw a marching. Maybe they just didn't come where I was. So if there were troublemakers, they were not able to destroy the unity of the town. And that's where African Americans came to Punta Gorda, so they could feel free. Thank you for the question, though. Thank you.
How large an African American population is there now in Punta Gorda?
All right. We used to be 2.9%, but people have been dying every week. We're probably less than 3% now. But sir, let me tell you why. I'm very proud of that. The pioneers who came, and they were the children of enslaved, they believed so firmly in education. As I told you, grown men would sit in classes with children so that they could have a school. Every one of those, I look at the census, the majority of those pioneers, there was no high school, okay? My mother went away. She had to live with family. My aunt had to live with family. The families would send their children to live with other families to get a high school diploma. There were only two major schools, A&M, it was FAMC then, and Bethune-Cookman were the colleges. Of the original families, the older families, most of those families, their children were not only got a high school education, they got college educations. My generation, we are not the first educated in our families in Punta Gorda. And that's why we had Jim Crow, remember? And so our school, we had sometimes from 2 to 4 teachers. So even if you became a teacher, you're a teacher or a nurse, you had to go somewhere else where you could work. You couldn't be a clerk in a store. You couldn't work as a secretary in an office. So they didn't come back. In the 60s, that whole Haynes family, their whole group, the whole family left and went to Atlanta. Atlanta was the place to be. And so we left. I left. I went to school in Michigan. I stayed in Michigan for a while, and then when things seemed to be better, I came back. I've only come back to Punta Gorda. I've been there like 20 years now as a retiree. I think only 2 or 3 of us have even come back to retire. Some did stay, but we're small because they educated their children. Their children all left. And so I'm very proud of the fact of who they are. That's why there are many more African Americans in Port Charlotte. We can really count them on our hands, and they keep every day. Somebody else goes, one of the old timers. So yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? Can I ask one more quick question? I missed the first few minutes and I didn't hear about Blanchard House. If we could visit where it is.
Thank you. Yes, the Blanchard House Museum is located on 406 Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard. We are open Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 2. However, if you have a group that wants to come over, we can make sure that we do a tour for you. We do want only to have 10 people in at a time. Let's say one group came, wanted to go to lunch or just look around outside, and then the other group came in, you can. You do have to wear a mask inside. And as I'm talking about that the Blanchard House was really the vision of my mother. If you come to Punta Gorda and you are on Olympia and you look right there at the courthouse, you will see the mural of George Brown. If you come down Olympia and look to your right, there's an eye doctor's place. The mural of a woman, a black woman sitting in a chair, is my mother, and I'm very, very proud of her. The Blanchard house was her dream. She said, like she said, you cannot tell Punta Gorda history without telling African American history. So you come to Punta Gorda, take a look at the mural for George Brown and the mural for my mother, Bernice Russell.
So thank you again, and thank you for all of your questions. I just want to remind you all again, I'll be passing out some surveys. We do have a lot more events that are happening. So we have one tomorrow at the Art Center and Boca Grande History Center. Collaboration between our two groups, Artists with a Sense of History art show, where art is going to be available for purchase. We also have a David Futch book reception, book signing and reception, and that's going to be in March. So we have more flyers and information, so please check out our table on your way out. Thank you so much for coming.
And may I say one thing? You have no idea of how fortunate you are to have Crystal. We used to have her. You are so fortunate. Crystal, I'm so happy for you.